Hi scholars! You are watching a video on forms. Right now you should have in front of you the handout that you were given in class so that you can fill in your guided note sheets and complete some of the exercises on the back. By the end of this video, you will be able to define and describe poetry and its forms, or have an initial definition of poetry. We'll talk about that later. You will also be able to briefly analyze the forms of segments of poems or tiny little poems and their parts. So today we're focusing on forms in poetry. So here are your poetry notes on form. What is poetry? This is the question we're going to be asking ourselves throughout this entire unit. The general definition is that poetry is a type of literature in which words are carefully chosen and arranged to create certain effects. Poets, who are the authors of poetry, use a variety of forms, imagery, sound devices, and figurative language to express emotions and ideas. So today we're focusing on the forms that authors use, that poets use. Check out that sunken yacht. Our first word that we need to know is the speaker of the poem. The speaker of the poem is called the narrator. The speaker is not always the same as the poet, although it can be. But when we're talking about a piece of poetry, sometimes we're talking about the speaker and sometimes we're talking about the author. So we need to be careful. So one example is like the speaker of a poem could be a cat. A cat did not write the poem, but the poet decided to have the poem come from the point of view of a cat. All right, so who are these poets? Something to know about poets. Poets are thrifty with their words, which means that they use only the words necessary to convey their meaning. So you might read a really long poem, but you can pretty much be guaranteed that every single word in that poem is absolutely necessary. Whereas fiction, sometimes you can give and take some words and it doesn't change the meaning. In poetry, if you change one word, you might change the entire meaning of the line. Excuse me. So the structure and form, this is what we're talking about today. A poem's form is the shape of a poem or the way words and lines are laid out on the page. Okay, so it's what it looks like or the pattern that a poet uses to convey their meaning. So poems are written using stanzas and lines. Most poems are written with stanzas. A stanza is a group of 2 or more lines that form a unit in a poem. They look kind of like paragraphs, but in order to read like a poet or like a literature professor, you need to make sure you're using the right words. We don't use paragraph when we're talking about poetry. So each stanza may have the same number of lines, or the number of lines may vary. That's part of the form of the poem. The line is the smallest part of a poem besides individual words. It's where the words stop and go to the next part down on a page. A line can be a complete sentence, or it can be just part of a sentence. You can break a sentence into lines. Our first form of poem is free verse. So poems can have a structure, or they can be in free verse. Free verse is when a poem does not have any regular rhyme or rhythm. There might be a little bits in there, but nothing that's regular where you can anticipate it. Some poets use free verse to capture the sounds and rhythms of regular speech. See what I did there? You had to listen on that one. So the blank that you want to fill in is regular speech. Okay, so you might have a free verse poem. Now this poem could be in free verse or there could be regular rhyme or rhythm. And then there are 2 kind of umbrella types of poetry. There's lyric poetry and narrative poetry. And that's less about what it looks like and more about what the poem is doing. So lyric poetry presents the personal thoughts and feelings of a single speaker. Most poems are lyric poems. I might be thinking about a certain person or a feeling that I have. I might be writing a love poem. I might be writing about my anger. Okay. Narrative poetry is poetry that tells a story. Okay. It's exactly like a piece of fiction, except there's probably rhyme or rhythm. So there's a narrator, and there is an exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution, just like you would find in short stories. So we have free verse. Now, lyric poetry or narrative poetry could be in free verse. This is where we get to a tricky part, which is that poems can have multiple forms. So here, our next form that you'll see a lot is called haiku. Haiku is a form of Japanese poetry in which 17 syllables are arranged in 3 lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables. The important thing about haiku is that sometimes it's translated from Japanese, so the syllables are not exact, but it's a tiny little poem that usually looks like the first line is a little shorter, the second line's a little longer, and the third line is a little shorter again. We'll see an example of one of those later. And haiku are usually lyric poems because it's too little to tell a whole story. A limerick, which is what a lot of students confuse with lyric, a limerick is a funny poem. It is Irish, and it usually has the rhyme scheme A-A-B-B-A. So there are 5 lines, and it's a funny poem. We'll see another example of those later. Humorous poetry. So humorous is a synonym for the word funny. It's poetry that evokes laughter and amusement. So limericks are one type of humorous poetry. Or you can have a free verse poem that's funny as well. Memorial poetry are pieces of poetry that preserve the memory of someone who has died. There are a lot of memorial poems out there because poets tend to like to write when they're experiencing a strong emotion or about a strong emotion. An ode is an example of a memorial poem, usually. So when you see the word ode, you might want to think about maybe that person has died. Sometimes not. Okay, so that's our basic overview of various forms of poetry. Now it's time to look at some samples so you can start to envision what this looks like. So flip your paper over and skim the page so you know what it looks like. This PowerPoint or video will guide you through the first 2 rows. The last 2 rows are extension activities that you can complete if you're awesome and ambitious or if you have extra class time one day. Especially there's one that uses the book. We will go over these next few exercises, so make sure you complete them for homework. I'm going to, for the part of this PowerPoint, I'm going to go very quickly through some poems, so you'll need to pause the video if you need more time to read and respond to the questions. All right, here we go. Box 1. You have a short little poem and several questions that go along with it. The poem is called The Names, and it's by Billy Collins, and this is actually just one part of it. So we're going to think, is this in free verse, or is there a regular pattern of rhyme or rhythm? Is this lyric or narrative? Is it telling a story, or is the author or poet just thinking about something? I'm going to read through this one, and the rest you're going to do on your own. Yesterday, I lay awake in the palm of the night. A soft rain stole in unhelped by any breeze, and when I saw the silver glaze on the windows, I started with A, with Ackerman as it happened, then Baxter and Calabro, Davis and Eberling, names falling into place as droplets fell through the dark. Okay, so as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, wow, those names are like raindrops. That's a pretty cool thing that the author did. So go ahead and look on the right side of your paper. Think, is this telling a story? Does it look like it's going to have action in it? I don't think so. It's just reflecting on raindrops. So that would be lyric poetry. There's no regular pattern of rhyme or rhythm, so it would be free verse. Now, does this seem like it is a memorial poem, like it's talking about the dead? When I see all these names listed and it says names falling into place, I'm thinking that those are probably names of people who have died. So this might be a memorial poem. Go ahead and respond to the other 2 questions in that box with your own personal thoughts. Pause the video as needed. In box number 2, you have 6 little poems, and you're going to decide what form each poem is. So again, I'm going to flip through this video rather quickly, and you need to pause, think about what type of poem this is. Is it free verse? Is it lyric? Is it narrative? Is it free verse and lyric, free verse and narrative? Is it a memorial poem? Is it a limerick? Is it a haiku? So go ahead and complete these exercises now. All right, you have reached the end of this first video of poetry. Congratulations, you made it out of the ruins. If you were being fancy, you noticed that the theme of this PowerPoint was, or video, was ruins. So I hope you enjoyed that. Here are some hot questions or higher order thinking questions that you'll want to consider before coming to class. Can you describe what poetry is? What's your definition? Why do you think authors choose different forms for their poetry? Think about that. Why would an author choose one certain form over another? Question 3, what's the difference between a memorial poem and a humorous one? If you're not sure about that one yet, make sure you've memorized those definitions. And number 4, can a poem have more than one type of form? Be able to explain that question when we come to class. Thank you, scholars. You did a wonderful job. I can't wait to see you and actually get to talk about the real fun stuff with poetry this unit.